Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
I have to say, I think this is going to be an exciting conversation. You were kind of one of the first voices that inspired me to get really geeked out on distributed energy resources about, 2017 when I first got involved in AEIC. You guys hosted when you were up at PG&E. So I look forward to talking all about what you've been up to the last 8 years. And before we get started, I'll just introduce you to the audience. We have Mark Esguerra, who is the Director of Distribution System Planning and Strategy for Southern Cal Edison, which I will let you kind of explore what that is and what you're up to and, the utility that you currently are working for. And then we'll jump into the discussion today.
Great. So thank you for having me aboard. This is definitely a privilege to be able to have this podcast here with you here. So Mark Esguerra, our Director of Distribution System Planning and Strategy at Southern California Edison. Southern California Edison pretty much serves the greater Southern California population. We have over 15 million customers in our region, roughly from a size of our electric grid, over 100,000 miles of distribution line, another 60,000 miles plus around transmission, over 800 some. So we've got a pretty large customer base. Our peak demand was slightly under 25 gigawatts. That was last 2 summers ago. Actually 24 gigawatts and some change. So we serve a pretty good size service territory. One of the things that's really top of mind here and in Southern California is preparing for wide-scale electrification. We're seeing the transportation industry looking to electrify. And that's one of the big areas that keeps me focused and really looking to expand the grid.
Great. I'm sure we could geek out on this topic a lot. As to some of my listeners have been around a while and has heard me talk, planning is where I spent my time within the utility space, really kind of helping gather the data, build the models, and run the studies that are required to kind of drive the insight and the intellect to kind of understand where to spend the capital and how we can drive out inefficiencies on our O&M, which I think, we don't say enough. We have to plan accordingly to do things effectively. And so it all starts with planning from what our customers are desiring to understanding the current system capacity and then being able to forecast or trust the forecasts to do the adequate planning. So this is where it all starts. And so I love this topic, so I'll try not to geek out too much here. I will also share, coming from the East Coast and learning all about what was happening in California, Hawaii, and Arizona, 8-10 years ago was quite exciting. And I think it was such a great place to sit and not learn, just learn and observe that it's not about if, it was when. And really, what were the fundamental learnings you guys all were able to gain access to, probably more than the rest of the nation, based on, the transformations that were happening in all elements. And we can go down those rabbit holes of why, but, here you are in the midst of it, preparing for electrification. And so when we say electrification, you're talking about what? What's being electrified, just for our audience?
Yeah, so within California, we have a number of policies, as do a number of other states, around reaching their clean energy or GHG goals. For California, we have objectives and goals by 2045 to be carbon neutral. And so a big part of the achieving those goals is around electric vehicles. And so you'll hear a lot on the transportation sector about electrifying the transportation sector. We have pretty ambitious goals on our passenger vehicles to be fully electric within a certain time frame, as well as the medium and heavy duty vehicles that are going to be electrified as well. And we say medium to heavy duty, you start thinking about basically the vehicles that transport goods and freights are looking to electrify. And we're getting a lot of requests in that area. And in addition to that, we're also looking at what we've called building electrification, where a good portion of the customers here in California will be looking at fully electrifying their buildings and at some point also their homes. And so we're seeing all those different changes in policy that's really driving a lot of electrification policies, as well as driving the need to expand the grid, but also how do you take advantage of the existing resources that are there to be able to help optimize as much capacity onto the grid. One thing I will add is that we've done an analysis on this. It's actually on our Edison International webpage if folks are looking to learn more about it. It's the latest white paper that we put together is called Countdown to 2045, where we've done a data-driven analysis, looked at what it would take to be able to achieve a lot of these carbon neutrality goals and how the electric sector, what are the different pathways that the electric sector can take. But more importantly, what's near and dear to my heart is understanding how the grid will have to adapt and where we need to expand. And so I think it's a pretty good read for folks that are interested to understand more about it. And we have described a lot of some of the work that we would need to undertake over the next several years.
And so when we talk about this, this is just kind of, what I see the objective and really why I show up on the Grid Mod Pod is, there is so much amazing work that's enabling and advancing the utilities to embrace this transformational change. And I think a lot of the attention and the language and the drivers, we get caught up in things such as like the grid is not going to be able to handle this. We're not prepared for this. Right, wrong, or indifferent, how and what the pressures are. The utilities in California have been under this growth, this change for probably longer than the other utilities as we go east. And so I guess I just want to share, for our audience, like you were in a space where having full situational awareness and a complete visualization of your distribution grid was once not. And it probably became very obvious in the time period of seeing this change that these models and the data required to build the models was required. So you've been through this growth. You've, from like a maturity perspective, you have your crawl, walk, run. I would just love to hear, as you've been through it in the industry out there, what have you seen and what has really surprised you at the capabilities to embrace technology and those innovative thinkers that we all know of to kind of create the visibility that you do have now? Is it the best? I think life is all about growing and enhancing and creating something more intuitive and more intelligent. But like from where you were 10 years ago to where you are now, can you explain kind of what that technology growth path was?
I think it started, if you maybe pick an area in this space of planning, you look at the planning tools, you look at how the technology has been evolving in that space, particularly also with what loads we were seeing. And a big driver back then, and it still is driving now, and you'll see it is a lot of the distributed energy resource technologies with, like, say, for example, solar voltaic, where, really those, you'll see the patterns on when those generate, which is typically in the daytime, and how those will decrease down as you get to evening, and then eventually no power during the evening. And then other technologies to storage, where you can charge and discharge at different hours. And that really moved the utility industry to start thinking about, hey, I really shouldn't be planning for just a single point in time. We're typically planning with looking at, particularly for distribution system planning, was really planning for one peak time period, and that's how you set your load growth plans. But with the advent of distributed resources and these other controllable loads that can charge and discharge at different hours, really required the utility industry to start looking at how do you get more granular information, such as getting to a place where you're understanding your hourly loads to be able to create what we're saying these demand curves are look like on your feeder, and then that really use that information to start making good decisions. And so that's some of the things when we start looking at tools is really trying to get to that place of how do you understand what your system is doing at different times of the day because you have these different devices. And so that's some of the evolutions that have taken on the planning tool for understanding how is your demand going to change over time? How is your generation going to change over time? And really getting a good picture on where those are interconnecting into the grid. And you'll see that with the industry that you've started to see more and more utilities are developing hosting capacity maps to better understand, what's their available capacity on your system. But even those maps are getting more granular where you can look at, depending on the hour and by season, roughly how much capacity you have available. And that way you can host more generation to be able to help meet some of those
energy goals that not only our customers have, but the state has. But then when you start coupling that in with the demand we're seeing now with like electric vehicles, where those can charge at different times of the day, and really it's going to be more behavioral on the customer or dependent on the business on their time to charge, really understanding when those are going to charge, not only where, but when and how much. And I think you need to have a really good, not only planning tool set, but you need to be able to capture the actual data to be able to validate how you think the system is performing, and then be able to start using that to start predicting in the future. So our planning tools have gone to starting to get to more granular levels, not only from a time dimension, but also on the grid. And then from there, you start to see even more use cases that are happening with AI and others to start doing predictive analytics on how your grid may behave. And then with that, you start to get into different scenarios and planning for that as well. I know I said a mouthful there, Liz, so let me know if there's any follow-ups.
Yeah, just a couple things. So, for, listeners such as my mother, she's one of my avid listeners. Thanks, Mom. You said hosting capacity, which is a very powerful tool in itself. And so just thinking about the evolution and the capability and the partnerships that were required in the industry to make that tool available to utilities in quite a quick ramp up time. One may say it's been around for 20, 25 years, but from being aware of the need, being able to procure, integrate, and then make it actually usable, as you were just mentioning, was a significant growth. And so when we're talking about capacity you guys have a map, right? So that's something else that they could check it out if they want to. It has all of the circuits in the distribution system, which quite frankly, before this dynamic change, we power systems engineers could quantify the capacity of the transformer at the substation and the rating of the breaker, and then the wire size and the distance it went, and calculate if we can continue to serve that one-way power flow. That has all been flipped on the head. And so the capacity study is a map of all of those circuits from the breaker all the way out to the edge, or aka the customer or the building. And this capacity map you're speaking of, it really identifies currently how much power is being used. And you said, like, at one point, we just studied one moment in time, usually the peak that like the breaker would see. And what you're talking about, because of the intermittency and the changing of that load patterns from very predictable, the hosting capacity will quantify what parts of the feeder have a specific utilization factor. So like how much energy, aka power, is it pulling to the rating of that wire, which is very granular. And so you guys have been able to create the model, develop the visualization of it, and then take the systems of record, aka the data, the usage of the grid, and interconnect it into that visualization. So I guess I just want to give you kudos. That's a large lift, and it's something that has become available. And because that you all went first, that capability, that accessibility to those tools are now available to the rest of us that own distribution grids. So I just want to give you more kudos for doing something extremely hard, and you're now doing it, and you're enabling customers, even though it may not seem like it for every pocket, to interconnect quite quickly. So I guess I wanted to ask, what has been the evolution of your interconnection process from once upon a time when customers just wanted to connect to their new home, to then the proliferation of once upon a time it was solar, now it's solar battery, now it's charging, right? So what has that been like for you all?
Yeah, it's been, I think it's one where we're continually learning. Yeah, I think we want to continue to be on that path. And I say
for those that are going down this journey or are on the journey, really staying close to what the customer is looking for in terms of information, particularly the developers, is going to be key. When we first built out these maps, the primary stakeholder was the solar industry, particularly trying to interconnect more rooftop solar. And so a lot of work was done to really try to cater to that. And I think the interconnection process in California, they were at one point, I think they were averaging initially, when the program first starting, roughly 30 business days. And the industry was really pushing for faster times because they've been working with customers to try to get the generation on. I think we got those down on average to like less than 3 business days. And some of the cases, it's really as soon as they send the application in, and if the circuit clears and there's not any major issues, they can actually receive their approval letter to be able to, experience their benefits of solar and be signed up for whatever program the utilities had at that time. And over time, what we've noticed is that growth continued, and as what you were getting at, Liz, now the devices got more complicated. You started looking at devices that start to charge, like storage. We've iterated and learned how to adjust our processes there. And I say now, the larger stakeholder that we're seeing here, at least in California, that's looking at our maps, and we realized we had to make some additional evolutions, was a lot of the EV charging infrastructure developers. And they're looking at consuming load, where the previous stakeholders that were really the major users were looking to try to deliver generation. Now these are really trying to consume load, and they're looking at not just smaller kilowatt scale, but megawatt scale. And so we really had to understand more what would help for those set of customers, and have started to build some of that understanding into our maps that we have. And I'm proud to say that one of the maps that we just put out there was a heat map that gets updated as soon as pretty regularly. I want to say once a week, specifically that's targeting our load interconnecting customers, particularly our EV charging customers, to be able to depict what's the available capacity on our grid to interconnect for load. And that's been a new evolution that we've introduced. And the reason why that became challenging is that we get applications pretty much daily for service, interconnection of service. And some of those projects will move forward, some of those projects will drop out. And really, how do you kind of include those projects that are actually going to be consuming power on the grid into the maps on a more dynamic basis? And so we've created some tools and actually updated our tool on the map to better depict that. So those that are interested, it's a pretty easy acronym, www.drpep.com, and you'll access Southern California Edison's hosting capacity maps, and you can sort through there to kind of understand what the available capacity is.
That's awesome. And so just a more perspective for our audience listeners, the interconnection process, right, it is, as you said, it was once upon a time 30 days. So like if you wanted to interconnect your solar, it was a process to ensure that allowing you to connect the solar, it was predominantly for safety reasons, that you're using the appropriate equipment, that the agreements are in place, that when the grid goes down, the inverter turns off, so there's no backfeed to, create harm's way for line workers and the public. And then that continuously evolved. People wanted to be connected quicker, but you also needed to understand the capacity of the grid. And so what I heard you say is, there was a learning curve, really, right? Like we as you think about what are utilities, they're businesses. What are businesses? They're made up of people, and there's only a particular know-how at certain states of time. So there's this new phenomena. You got to pivot, you got to adjust. And to create the systems that you spoke of, it just can't happen overnight. There's a lot of integrated data that has to travel through various business units to then have action taken upon. So the fact you guys got it to 3 days or even a shorter amount of time, is an incredible feat. But I just want to also share to the rest of the utilities that are on this journey, it takes time and just really the people to understand it, to allow it, and to move it forward.
Can I just add a couple of things, just on little things there too, for in the early days? I think when you start looking at how the process to interconnect our generation, particularly like solar, it was a very manual process at first. Even we had to take a closer look at a whole end-to-end view from application all the way to basically commissioning the meter to allow solar. And we, along the way, learned it started very manual. We've made enhancements to the point where a lot of the applications are now pretty much all done online, gets processed pretty much in that fashion. And that would be kind of my suggestion to those utilities, like understand kind of like the growth of these opportunities in your system. And there will be a learning curve exactly on how to intake the applications, how to process. But I think where we're going at some point is really how do you automate as much of that work? Because we got to a point where the volumes just became pretty significant. And you look at the state of California, behind the meter net energy metering solar, we have about 15 gigawatts behind the meter for the entire state, which is pretty significant.
People are installing solar.
That was, yeah. When you look at an aggregate, it's there's a significant. It's slowed down a little bit because the incentives have modified, but it's just an amazing amount. We believe that it's over the next 20 years, it's probably going to double. But the big opportunity that we're seeing in California, that we're seeing a more potential growth in, is on energy storage. Right now, behind the meter for California, I think we're about 2 gigawatts behind the meter of energy storage. Southern California Edison, we've got about a gigawatt of that behind the meter. We've got others in front of the meter, but behind the meter energy storage, about a gigawatt. That's significant, but we're expecting to meet, in order to meet a lot of our carbon objectives, we're expecting that to actually increase by 10x. So we're expecting to see a higher volume of energy storage system-wide in California, and it'll be a big part of the energy.
And I guess, for all of the listeners, that you learn by doing, and it is tricky because electricity is the lifeline of society. So we have to ensure that it's available to all. And these dynamic changes, even if available to some, how they integrate and interact with the larger grid that serves all, it ultimately becomes something that all must utilize. So and what I hear is like, this is my brain, if the edge becomes more intelligent and our customers become more aware that they can have more ownership of how they utilize energy and when to use it and what devices to connect. And as more and more people do it, it'll become more affordable, just like going from horse and buggy to cars or to shoveling coal into your coal furnace in your basement to gas, right? I mean, like, we've been through these evolutions, but just knowing that, again, the utility is a grid that serves all. So that cautious reality exists for all of us. And so I guess, again, just want to share, just observing the West from the East, it's really empowering. And you give us the tools and really the visibility that this is available to us customers. And I always love to plug on the Grid Mod Pod, all of these advancements that we're making, empowering the technology that's available to us now, is for the customer and the service that we provide them. So a big part of Grid Modernization is all about the customer. I think one more topic I want to hit with you, if we have time for that, is, the load forecasting. So here you are, you have the tool to run the studies with the data that's provided to you, and that data is provided through the interconnection queue. But to plan accordingly, to build any kind of infrastructure project, you got to get that idea into the capital stack well in advance. And then you have to procure and build. So your forecasts are really important. So how's that going, and what's the involvement that you've seen at Southern California from you?
That's a great question, Liz. So the forecasting, at least what we're seeing here, is the large demand that we're seeing on electrification is definitely the transportation sector. And a lot of our customers can order a truck and have it delivered in a much quicker time frame than major utility infrastructure can be built. So really, there's more work that's being done to proactively reach out to the customers that we are identifying as high likelihood to adopt electric vehicles, particularly in the medium to heavy duty sector, as well as we've been doing a lot of what we call our transportation electrification fleet operator charging station developer workshop and engagement process. So we last year we held a couple of workshops with the top fleet operators as well as the charging station developers, one to kind of share what Edison is doing in this area, but also what our processes look like, but also to start to dialogue on what plans they have, because it does take time to build this infrastructure. Having that early intel to be able to put it in your planning process is definitely going to help go a long way. Our cycle times here, there's challenges with supply and really getting things built, have increased. And so the way you counteract that, you can go after those barriers to try to mitigate that. But the other lever we have is really, getting information as early as possible, having those dialogues so that we could build it into our forecast to plan on where the growth is going to occur. And not only is it where and when the growth is going to occur, but some of the questions there with this load being more deemed flexible, they can charge at different times. What's the charging profiles going to look like? So it's another level of complexity that in our forecast we get questions on, where and when, but like, okay, how is the load going to show up? What profiles do you have? And really, we're building our knowledge in that area by trying to work with the industry, understand kind of the data they have on actual charging that's going to occur, as well as the lessons and information that we have. So that's an area that I think we're all going to learn in this industry as well, but it also adds more complexity into the forecast.
So I guess, pulling up here, thinking about just a fun fact. So AEIC has been around since 1885. And I have the privilege of having access to the original meeting minutes. And when you open up the 1885 to 1888 book, there's a graph and there's a manual drawing of the various members' load curves. So when you think about it, it was very manual, and it was available with the technology that was there 140 years ago. And so when we think about what is occurring, the ever-evolving change. So from a planning organization, as you mentioned earlier, the interconnection process was very manual. The load forecasting was very manual. Like, you receive information, you put it in a diagram, and then you would do some hand calculations from planning the wire size and whatnot. As the utility space has evolved, and this is really maybe for any aspiring engineers out there listening in school or maybe in high school, the world that we're living in is so cool, right? The advancements that are required and needed for bright-minded people to look at a manual process and use technology to automate and drive those processes in a more efficient way is ripe, right? And so there's large software companies that are available and engaged, but every utility is evolving in a different space at a different time, and they need that internal folk to see it, feel it, and then develop the tools to make it more efficient. So just within your space, there's a team of interconnection engineers, there's a team of planning engineers, and then there's load forecasting analytics, right? And those all are humans that are required to have a bigger picture and help develop tools to do the work that used to be done in a very manual way. Especially because, as you just said, you have how many requests on a daily basis. You just don't have enough human capital to do it manually anymore. So it's great stuff. I just love seeing what you all are doing and what you're making possible for the rest of us to kind of embrace this transformational change, which truthfully is what we've all been a part of, is innovation and new ways of making things, for lack of a better word, opportunity available to us in an easier, more efficient way. And I guess one more fun fact, there was a time when us utilities had storefronts to sell washers and dryers and vacuums and irons, right? So there's this idea that we've grown the grid to meet a very uptick evolution of electrification. And I think we're in this fourth industrial revolution where we're just going to get ahead of it. And with people like you leading the charge, I really appreciate that. And so thanks, Mark, for jumping on and sharing it. So any last words for our listeners as well?
I would say the future is going to be very exciting as we go in with this technology that's being integrated into our grid. And I'd say the future is bright and exciting time for the power industry.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.